Welcome back to Face the Nation. We'd like to welcome our panel now for some political analysis. Seung Kim covers Congress and the White House for the Washington Post. John Harris is editor-in-chief of Politico, and Nancy Cordes is the chief congressional correspondent here at CBS. Seung, I want to start with you. You heard Leader McConnell feeling pretty good about the way this week ended up. Was it in doubt, or was Susan Collins the key vote, kind of always going to yes, and there was nothing to stop her to going to no?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that Mitch McConnell pointed out in his interview with me and other news outlets was that he didn't know where the votes were until he walked into that chamber and heard every one of his members vote aye, or in Lisa Murkowski's case, vote no. I think looking back at Susan Collins' speech, with her forceful line-by-line defense of Judge Kavanaugh, it seemed like she wanted to be a yes all along, and she just wanted to make sure all the T's were crossed and all the I's were dotted before she was able to get that. But that was one of the most forceful defenses of Kavanaugh that I've seen throughout this confirmation process, at a time when we've seen senators like Lindsey Graham and John Cornyn and Orrin Hatch just go to the mat for Judge Kavanaugh. So to see her defense and to have known that she, was able to get to that place while saying she was undecided all along was just really interesting. And I think we saw for a while that she wanted to be a yes. I think these are Republican senators. I mean, they want to vote in favor of Supreme Court justice. Susan Collins has never voted against a Supreme Court nominee, whether from a Democratic president or a Republican president. But it was just really interesting to see how that all played out in the end.
John, Leader McConnell, in another interview, maybe I can't remember which of the ones he's done, but he said it was after Dr. Ford testified, it was kind of halftime. They thought they might be losing the nomination. And then at the end, you have him saying, boy, this really fired up the base. Not only did they get an associate justice, they now are fired up. What happened between the two?
I think that Judge Kavanaugh, who surprised everybody with that fiery blast that he delivered with his testimony, did follow the essential rule of modern politics in the polarized era, which is get people to say, which side are you on? And it's an interesting thought experiment. If he had come out, as many people expect him to do, with a more temperate statement like, look, I'm really sorry, something bad must have happened, but you have to trust me, it wasn't this. I regret that I used to drink too much as a young person. I'm a different, more mature person now. Many of us thought he would say something like that. Would that have worked? I have to say, in my experience, which now goes back a generation to these really polarizing battles, that kind of middle-of-the-road approach isn't really the most successful. He probably did the politically shrewd thing, which is say, look, nope, I'm drawing a sharp line, and everybody can decide which side they're on.
Nancy, you were all over this. The Democrats, how do they feel they did at the end of this, both politically and then specifically with respect to Kavanaugh, but then the larger set of issues here that Democrats care a great deal about, which is protecting witnesses, listening to the accused, and so forth?
Well, I think they're obviously incredibly dejected, but I think that they felt that they had no choice but to go to the mat for a couple of different reasons. First of all, their base was so frustrated after the Merrick Garland experience. And so had they not fought to the very end over this, that would have left the base even more disaffected in advance of the midterm elections. They wanted them to show, okay, the Republicans really fought and won on Merrick Garland. Show us what you got this time around. So that left them with no choice but to, stall and delay and do anything that they could.
One strategic error that Democrats have been pointing on, back to John's point about going, hard and strong, and whose side are you on? Michael Avenatti, Stormy Daniels' lawyer, who came in with a late-breaking addition to this story. A lot of Democrats are saying, and are you hearing this, that Avenatti took what was a sympathetic case with Ford and turned it into a circus, losing them the high ground. Are you hearing that?
And it is very interesting. It was very interesting to watch all the way along how Democrats dealt with these Avenatti allegations, because at first they really kept them at arm's length. They didn't know what to make of them. Then the day that Julie Swetnick actually released her sworn statement, both sides were shocked. You even had Republicans who thought it was all over. I had one Republican aide say to me, America should be devastated. Michael Avenatti brought the heat. And then as some questions started to come up about her story, Democrats then again retreated, most of them. You did still have, the challenge for Democrats was their line was, you should believe women. So they didn't really have the option to pick and choose and say, so we believe these two women, but we don't necessarily believe this woman. So they were sort of stuck with an all or nothing situation.
Seung, what did you make? I asked Leader McConnell if Lisa Murkowski should pay a price for the vote, and his response was, I'd like to talk about the success we had.
You tried your darndest. I tried twice in my interview with him yesterday to talk about Murkowski and her vote, and particularly her reasoning why she voted no, which was the temperament issue, which I found fascinating. But you have to look at Lisa Murkowski and her political history in Alaska. I mean, I know the president told my colleague Phil Rucker in a phone interview yesterday that she's toast. I mean, it's not going to play well for her politically. Remember, this is a woman who lost her own primary in 2010. Party leadership shunned her back in Washington. She had to resign from her top leadership post. And then she won a write-in campaign. And her last name is not easy to spell. It's Murkowski. But she has this very unique political coalition in Alaska. She does not need the party nor the party leadership to succeed.
Look, it's our job, John, to talk about political strategies and messages and dissect them. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that really mathematics is decisive in these things. And there's no way with a margin that narrow that somebody like Mitch McConnell is going to want to push people out of his party. I don't think you're going to see Democrats trying to impose a big price on Joe Manchin for voting yes. Mathematics is what matters, and it's really what carried the day in this.
And I also think that she and Susan Collins had different political calculations here. You know, you often see them voting together, but in this case, you had Alaska leaders coming out against Kavanaugh, Republicans. You had Native American groups, very influential in Alaska, coming out against him as well. So she may not have been as worried about the political price she would pay for voting no, whereas Susan Collins knew that it was going to be a very different situation in Maine.
Speaking of making political calculations, John, I want to get your thoughts about, you talked about this, whose side are you on? We traveled some distance here between, Senator John Cornyn came out and said, you know, the holes in Dr. Ford's testimony are the kind of things that happen in a traumatic episode. It was a very sympathetic reading of what she did. Then a week later, President Trump is on the stump saying, basically making fun of the fact that she couldn't remember various things. Did that moment have some benefit, play some role in this, when the president did what a lot of people thought at first was, oh my gosh, he's not being restrained, he's essentially making fun of this woman and that'll hurt him politically? Or did he know something smart about politics these days?
You know, it all depends on whose ears are receiving a message. And what we were talking about here was the senator's ears. I really will say that I don't think many Republican senators were eager to hear that. Mm-hmm. But mathematics was decisive. I think there were a lot of people in sort of Trump's base who were eager to hear that and enjoyed it. You know, and I think we don't really still know the political implications. Yeah. Clearly, in the red state Senate races, like North Dakota, this probably, or were Democrats actually defending a seat there, but this Kavanaugh helps Republicans. I think we're going to probably see the exact opposite in a lot of these suburban races on which the House of Representatives will hinge. Right. They've got different political lessons pointing different directions.
Exactly. That's a great point. Seung, what do you think of the long-term? Senator McConnell said this fired everybody up. Do people stay fired up for the next month?
I think so. Well, I think they would, because we saw the impact of the 1991 proceedings with now Justice Thomas and Anita Hill, and you saw the Year of the Woman come a year after those hearings happened. The midterms are only a month away, and I think you've seen it'll be a fascinating experiment to see how much this matters, because the big test is only a few short weeks away. Mitch McConnell, and I mean, frankly, I've never seen Mitch McConnell so happy than in the last couple of days, because he truly believes, and he told me he had seen polling already that shows just how unifying this issue was for the Republican Party.
Well, just on the Democratic side, they've been hard to find after this loss, and we tried to reach out to a number of them. Is somebody going to be able to make use of this to get their own voters? You know,
even Democrats will acknowledge when you talk to them that they are already seeing out on the stump when they go home for the weekends that the Republican base is more fired up than it was just a few weeks ago. So they acknowledge that this is a real thing. It's not just something that you're seeing in the polls. It's not a blip. They are encountering it. And the question for them is, their base has been fired up for a long time now. So they have sustained this level of energy. Is this Republican energy, is it a blip? And now that they got the Supreme Court justice they want, they go back to being content? Or is that, energy that is going to last another month?
One way in which it may last, John, is related to something that that Bret Stephens wrote about in the New York Times. He's been a vocal Trump critic, but he said in this case he was happy to have the president in there. He said because he was feeling grateful that in Trump at least one big bully was willing to stand up to the others in this case being those on the left. And so the idea is that if the left is behaving in this way, kind of we need our bully. Do you think that's an argument that grows beyond this moment?
There is a phenomenon in politics. In fact, I write a little bit about it on Politico today. Both parties tend to believe, when you talk with them privately, we're more virtuous, but the other side is more ruthless, and they benefit by being more ruthless. And a bunch of Democrats believe that today. Mitch McConnell is ruthless, but look, it worked for him by bending procedural rules with Merrick Garland and again with the FBI investigation into Kavanaugh. I tend to think that it's kind of a conceit of both parties, that if we could just be as vicious as the other side, we'd prevail. I think in this instance, though, different to Seung-min's point than 1991, we are now in a political culture where a lot of people have trouble remembering what they were indignant about the week before last. Remember in 2016, we thought the Access Hollywood tape was going to sink Donald Trump, but a month later, clearly was not the decisive factor in which people were voting.
Seung-min, I want to back to McConnell for a moment. You could make a case that conservatives are very happy they got two people on the court. Clearly, Donald Trump is responsible for that. But Mitch McConnell may be a great deal more responsible in that he held up the Merrick Garland's nomination, which got a lot of voters who were worried about Donald Trump to say, worried, yes, but if he can name the next court. So he did that, and he shepherded through two. This is a historic career-capping moment, those three things that McConnell has done.
I mean, there are a few things policy-wise that Mitch McConnell cares more about than helping to reshape the federal judiciary. And we talk about how he held up Merrick Garland's nomination for a year. We also, what he subtly did, which didn't get a lot of attention in 2015 and 2016, is he actually blocked many of President Obama's circuit court nominees and district court nominees, which is why when President Trump was elected, he came in with this unusually historically high number of vacancies. So he has, President Trump and Mitch McConnell have the two conservative justices installed on the court with Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch, but they have already reshaped the federal judiciary on so many different levels. And Mitch McConnell has said over and over that blocking Merrick Garland was one of the best decisions he's made.
Nancy, Mitch McConnell today said he's not going to question anybody's motives about the Kavanaugh vote. But of course, Republicans were very successful indeed doing just that with the Democratic opponents. Mitch McConnell also talked about bipartisanship. Is he going to try to kind of make the Senate come back to its old ways, or is that, what do you make of that?
I think that there's a lot of pessimism on both sides that the Senate can work, at least right now, the way that it used to. But the reality is there's almost nothing more momentous that senators do than decide on a justice who has the potential to change the balance of the Supreme Court. So this was always going to be a battle royale, almost no matter who it was, Brett Kavanaugh or Amy Coney Barrett or anyone else. This was going to be a huge clash from the very beginning. And
John, last question to you. We've seen partisanship in the presidency and in the legislative. Where does it now stand with respect to the Supreme Court?
Well, I was very interested in your exchange, John, with Mitch McConnell, who I think likes to think of himself as an institutionalist. But in fact, that's not his legacy. He won, but he also owns the way he won, which means the Senate is polarized, the Supreme Court is polarized, and obviously the presidency's been polarized for a long time. And he knows that he owns part of that. That's why he was so scratchy and defensive with you.
All right, we will end it on scratchy and defensive. Thank you to all of you for being here, and we'll be back in a moment. We'd like to go now to Seoul, South Korea, and CBS News correspondent Errol Barnett, who's covering Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's trip to the region. Errol?
John, America's top diplomat received quite a warm welcome when he landed in Pyongyang today, which is in stark contrast to when he was effectively stood up by Chairman Kim Jong-un back in July. This time around, the American and North Korean delegations, led by Secretary Pompeo and Chairman Kim, met for 2 hours, followed by a formal lunch. The two sides are getting closer, we are told, to figuring out where and when President Trump will hold a second summit with Kim. The U.S. wants Pyongyang to irreversibly denuclearize in a way that can be verified, and it wants it done by 2021, the end of President Trump's first term, while North Korea wants UN sanctions lifted and the U.S. to declare an end to the Korean War, neither of which is likely in the short term. Pompeo is here in Seoul tonight to reassure South Korean Prime Minister Moon Jae-in talks are moving in the right direction.
As President Trump has said, there are many steps along the way, and we took one of them today with another step forward. And so this is, I think, a good outcome for all of us.
Secretary Pompeo also tells President Moon that President Trump will meet Chairman Kim at the earliest possible date. Now, before he returns to Washington, Pompeo wraps up this tour through East Asia in Beijing. There he will meet with President Xi Jinping and encourage him to fully enforce sanctions against North Korea, while also attempting to smooth over tensions stemming from the ongoing trade war with the U.S.
Errol Barnett for us in Seoul, South Korea. Thanks, Errol, and we'll be back in a moment. And we're back with reporter and author Greg Miller. He covers national security for the Washington Post, and his latest book is The Apprentice: Trump, Russia, and the Subversion of American Democracy. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with the recent news, which is of indictments against Russian hacking having to do with the Olympics.
Yeah, this is really interesting. These are indictments that we're just learning about now, but it's actually for activity that was happening around the same time as the election, in large measure. I think this shows just that we're in a new era of aggressive espionage, unlike anything we've ever been through. And that's what the book is largely about. And, you know, we face this great challenge at this moment from Russia, which is using espionage, using cyber operations to go at adversaries around the globe, including the United States. And here we are with a president who refuses to acknowledge any of that.
Give us a sense of how alive to this possibility of Russian intelligence hacking the Obama administration was, and now it's obviously everybody knows about it. But yeah. Were they slow on the uptake?
They were slow in one important way. I mean, I think that at the time when the initial penetration of the DNC by Russian intelligence operatives, Russian hackers, was detected, it was treated as just another in a long line of cyber penetrations by China, by Russia. They grab stuff, they look at the secrets, end of story, kind of. Nobody saw the second act here. Nobody saw the dumping of all this material, the weaponizing of this information by putting it out on WikiLeaks to hurt Hillary Clinton, to sow unrest in the United States, and later to help Donald Trump win.
And this is one of the great things about your book, is that it kind of connects what we thought were disparate events and puts them into a kind of narrative, right? So yes. On that WikiLeaks point, so they thought it was just mischief making, but it was mischief making which then was turned into a weapon, was deployed in the middle of an election.
Correct. So everybody expects Russia to engage in espionage. The United States does as well. To take what they get and then throw it out there for the world to see is really, really unusual. But we do see it now more and more. And this connects to the hacks that we learned about this week of anti-doping agencies. Those are designed to be overt acts, ultimately, to steal information, to try to discredit an adversary of the Kremlin.
And so then a third thing, which you will write about in the book, of course, this great question of whether the information weaponized, was it weaponized with the help of anybody in the Trump orbit?
Right. And I mean, obviously, we're waiting for Robert Mueller to give us the final answer to that question, and he's kept that very close hold. But of course, what I did in this book is try to trace out all the connections, and there are many, many connections, right? So the Trump Tower connections, Manafort's longstanding connections with the Kremlin, lots of interactions between Trump and his family, even well before the elections, with Russia, seeking meetings with Vladimir Putin and so forth.
What else in the book, when you think of the big pillars of this story, which you've had a chance to think about because you've taken a moment and stepped back from the crazy news cycle, what are the other big pillars for you? I mean,
I just want to reiterate what you just said. I think that part of the value of this book, to me even, was putting it all together in one place because, you know, I was a reporter at the Post covering these stories as they were unfolding, the Mike Flynn story and so forth. And even I was just frequently lost, right? Getting lost in the daily deluge of information. So what I really tried to do with this book is put it together in a clean narrative. And even then, I was seeing connections that I was blind to at the time. It's really astonishing.
The administration has started talking about China a lot. Mike Pence spoke about the threat from China in a speech. Put that in context with respect to what the Russians have done, and what are the Chinese up to?
So, yeah, it's really interesting that the administration is sort of going after China right now. And China, of course, is aggressive in espionage and cyber espionage in particular, and has been for many years. The administration hasn't coughed up much evidence so far that they're interfering in a meaningful way in the upcoming election. I mean, China does put ads in newspapers and things like this, but I think the contrast is what's striking. What they are saying about China and what they're not saying about Russia, and you put those two things together, it's really, really hard to reconcile.
And what they have not said about Russia at other points along the line in the last 2 years.
Of course, right. We've just never seen the president really call out Russia in any meaningful way for what happened.
Let me ask you, since you cover national security, give me a sense of where President Trump, as a president who interacts with his national security officials, how does he do it relative to the way previous presidents have done?
It's unlike anything any of us has seen in our lifetimes, I think, in terms of his disengagement from the national security apparatus, right? And even beyond that, it's almost schizophrenic administration at times. And the book really goes into a lot of detail in this. It's not just about the election and the hacking. It is about Trump as president and how he's treated Russia, often in conflict with his own advisors, with his own cabinet.
What is the difference between John Bolton as the national security advisor and Henry McMaster?
McMaster was really much more into process and trying to bring the president along through briefings and elaborate presentations and so forth, and meetings and getting consensus. And Bolton sort of cuts through all that. I think he appeals to Trump in one way in that he sort of simplifies things for the president. It's a much smaller, tighter held process, and then he's working more closely with the president.
Does that argue then that it's perhaps more efficient?
It's more efficient, except that, there are more people on the outside, more important people, more important voices, probably not getting heard the same way that they were getting heard across the administration under McMaster.
Quickly, what's the thing on the national security horizon we should be paying attention to?
Well, of course, the Mueller probe wrapping up. I mean, I think that we're about to enter Act 3 of this crazy drama.
All right, Greg Miller, thanks so much. The book is The Apprentice. There it is. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson. But I'll see you tomorrow and every day this week on CBS This Morning.